Picture this. You're walking through a quiet estate on the edge of a Midwestern town, the kind of place where the air feels heavy with memory. Old trees lean in, their branches knitting together like they're trying to protect a secret. There's a river moving slowly nearby, dark and glassy, reflecting a sky that never seems quite blue enough. Ahead of you rises a stone mansion, massive but strangely withdrawn, as if it didn't expect anyone to still be looking at it this many years later. The windows are tall and narrow. Some are lit from within with a weak yellow glow. Most are dark. Ivy has crawled over much of the stone. It doesn't feel abandoned exactly, but it doesn't feel alive either. It feels haunted, not by ghosts in sheets, but by choices, by consequences. Now imagine someone tells you, this place belonged to a man millions of people admired, a man who changed how the entire world works, how cities are built, how families live, how we move, how we work. A man presented in school books as the genius who put the world on wheels. And yet, behind those doors, in those quiet hallways, decisions were made that broke people, wrecked families, gave comfort to hatred, and shaped some of the ugliest corners of the 20th century. This is one of Henry Ford's mansions. And once you know what really happened behind those walls, it's very hard to see the genius in the same way again. Because Henry Ford didn't just build cars. He built a kind of empire made of stone and wood and manicured lawns, an empire of mansions, places where he hid from the world and from himself, places where fear walked around dressed as security, where loyalty looked a lot like control, and where the American dream had a very dark basement. So let's step inside together. Imagine the front door swinging open with that old heavy creak, and we'll walk room by room, story by story, through the dark side of Henry Ford's mansion empire. You probably know the simple version of the Henry Ford story. Poor farm boy, mechanical genius, builds a car the average person can afford, pays his workers good wages, creates the assembly line, becomes a symbol of American innovation, hard work, and success. It's tidy, it's inspiring, it fits in a textbook chapter. But like most tidy stories, it's edited. What doesn't fit so easily into that story is the man who slept in these rooms, walked these hallways at night, stood in a library lit by a few lamps and signed orders that would send company detectives into workers' homes, into union meetings, into hospital rooms. The man who will smile for the camera with schoolchildren outside the front door, and then go inside and approve articles attacking Jewish people, or refuse safety improvements that might save lives but cost money, or push his own son past the breaking point. To understand why his mansion empire feels so heavy, we have to back up a bit. Henry Ford was born on a farm in 1863. That's a world of mud, horses, and candles, the kind of life where winter dominates everything, and work never truly stops. He didn't like that life. Machines fascinated him, not just because they were clever, but because they represented escape. A good machine could do the work of 10 people. A car could carry you away from the stuck little world you were born into. And that's exactly what Henry did. He left the farm. He learned to repair watches. He became an engineer. He kept tinkering with engines. And eventually, after failures and bankruptcies and a lot of stubbornness, he found the formula. A simple, reliable car built cheaply in massive numbers. The Model T changed everything. Not just for the buyers, but for Henry himself. You know that cliche about someone going from rags to riches? Henry Ford didn't just go from rags to riches. He went from no electricity in the house to I can build myself a private kingdom in what was, historically speaking, the blink of an eye. And when that much money hits one person fast, it does something peculiar. It doesn't always turn them into the happy, generous figure in the newspaper cartoons. Sometimes it creates a gap between what they say they believe and what they actually do. Henry Ford's public persona was simple. He was for the common man. He said he wanted his workers paid well. He said he hated waste. He said luxury was decadent. He liked to be seen in simple suits, driving his own cars, talking plain, avoiding big city flash. So it surprises some people the first time they see his main estate, because nothing about it feels simple. We're in Dearborn, Michigan. Early 1900s, the car business is booming so fast that even Henry's nightmares can't keep up with it. He's drowning in money. And like anyone who suddenly has more than they can really process, he starts building. He buys land along the River Rouge, not far from where his factories will rise. Not a little patch either. Hundreds of acres, rolling lawn, forest, river, gardens. He hires architects, landscape designers, craftsmen. He names the place after the Ford family's ancestral region in Ireland, Fair Lane. Fair Lane is supposed to be a home, but let's be honest, it's a statement. From the outside, it looks like something out of an English country estate painting. Stone walls, gables, tall chimneys, leaded glass windows that catch the light in a soft, old-world way. There's a powerhouse, a dam, a hydroelectric system. The property can generate its own electricity. There are greenhouses, gardens, a boathouse, winding paths through the woods. It's self-sufficient, it's beautiful, and it's fortified. Not in an obvious castle with battlements way, but the more time you spend in this house, the more you realize it wasn't built just for comfort. It was built for control. Walk with me into the front hall. Imagine the sound your shoes make on the stone floor. There's the smell of old wood polish, faint dust, maybe a little bit of river dampness under everything. The ceilings are high but not soaring. Ford didn't want Versailles. He wanted a place that felt old, established, respectable. The message is, I belong here. I've always belonged here. Don't question it. But look closer. Servants' corridors run behind the main rooms, allowing staff to move silently, invisibly. Service stairs connect floors without ever crossing the grand front staircase. Doors can be closed in ways that split the house into private zones. From certain rooms, you can look out over the driveway and see who's coming long before they reach the door. It's a house designed so the owner can see without always being seen. He can hear without always being heard. He can move through his world while the rest of the world is managed, filtered, softened before it reaches him. This instinct, to control, to observe, to withdraw, is going to show up everywhere in Henry Ford's life. In his factories, in his private security forces, in his family, and yes, in his mansions. Now, imagine standing in his study. Wood-paneled walls, heavy desk, shelves of books, some read, many probably not. A few pieces of antique furniture that have the look of things bought not because someone loved them, but because they made the room feel serious. Papers spread out, letters from politicians, businessmen, fans, reports from his factories, reports from places most CEOs didn't need, his sociological department, his service department. On the desk, there might be a model of a car, a photograph of the River Rouge plant as it grows into one of the biggest industrial complexes in the world, maybe a family photo, maybe not prominently placed. Right here, in this room, Ford made decisions that shaped not just his company, but people's lives in ways they'd carry to their graves. You have to remember, his factories weren't just any factories. They were one of the harshest, most intense industrial environments on Earth. The assembly line that made the Model T affordable also made the work brutal. You stood in one place, did the same motion thousands of times a day, under the eye of foremen, supervisors, time study men. The line set the pace. The machine dictated your body. Turnover was so high that Ford couldn't keep enough workers. People quit. They burned out. They got injured. They walked away. Ford's answer was twofold. First, he offered something that made headlines, $5 a day. At the time, that was a fortune compared to many other jobs. It was a baited hook. You could afford the very car you were building. You could move into a better house. You could dream. Second, he wrapped that wage in conditions. This is where the mansion and the factory start to blur. The sociological department was created to help workers live proper lives. Inspectors would visit your home. They'd check if you drank too much, if your house was clean enough, if your wife managed the household properly, if you saved money instead of wasting it. They'd ask about your habits, your friends, your church. If you didn't meet their standards, you might lose your bonus, maybe even your job. Imagine working all day on a deafening factory floor, then coming home to your little rental house. And one day there's a knock on the door. It's not your neighbor, it's Henry Ford's men, asking to look in your cupboards, asking what language you speak around the dinner table, asking if you're American enough yet. And somewhere upriver, in a quiet, glowing room at Fair Lane, the man who authorized all of this is having a late-night cup of coffee, perhaps grumbling about lazy workers or moral decay, while looking out at lanterns flickering along his carriage drive. The $5 a day wage sounded generous. The reality for many workers felt intrusive, claustrophobic, like your boss had followed you home. That same desire to control the worker's life didn't stop at his front door. It spilled out into the streets, the taverns, the union halls. Because when workers tried to organize and push back, To say, you know what? The wage is nice, but we also want shorter hours, safer conditions. A voice at the table. Ford didn't exactly welcome that conversation. This is where another name comes in. Harry Bennett. If you picture the mansion as a kind of stage where the elite live out their dramas, Harry Bennett is like the guard dog who sometimes sits at the table. Bennett was Ford's strongman, ex-Navy sailor, boxer, tough guy. Henry liked him. Maybe he saw in Bennett the rough edge he felt he lost when he left the farm. Bennett became head of Ford's notorious service department. Service department sounds harmless, like they help tune your car or bring you coffee. In reality, it was more like a private army mixed with a spy ring. They monitored workers. They broke up union meetings. They beat organizers. They infiltrated. They intimidated. And while the actual fists and clubs came out near factory gates or on city streets, the orders, the funding, the approval, those chains ran right back up to Henry. To rooms like that study in Fair Lane. There's a chilling image people sometimes describe. Picture a Ford executive or Bennett himself driving up to the mansion. The big house lit from within, its reflection on the dark river, the crunch of gravel under tires. They go inside, hang up their coat, step into that wood-paneled room. They talk quietly with Henry about the trouble at the Rouge, about agitators, about Bolsheviks or foreign elements. They talk about how firm a response should be. Henry nods, maybe grunts, gives his approval. Then they head back down, back toward the factories, carrying decisions that will turn into cracked ribs, lost jobs, maybe a dead body. On paper, those decisions are just memos. In reality, they're lived in bruises. That's one layer of darkness in this mansion empire, the separation between where decisions are made and where pain is felt, the insulation of luxury. You walk through the dining room at Fair Lane with its polished table and soft rugs, and it's easy to forget the people eating here commanded the lives of tens of thousands of workers who could never even stand in this doorway. It's easy to forget that while a roast is being carved in this room, a man on the factory floor might be having his wages cut as punishment for speaking up. This disconnect isn't unique to Henry Ford, of course. It's part of industrial capitalism everywhere. But Ford's case is especially sharp because he marketed himself as different, as a friend of the worker, as the man who shared the profits. The mansions tell a slightly different story. Let's move from the dining room into the private areas. Bedrooms, sitting rooms, the spaces where family life unfolds. Henry's wife, Clara, was, by all accounts, strong-willed, intelligent, and more socially aware than her husband. She had to find a way to live in this house with a man whose moods could run from charming to harsh, whose ideas about the world were intense, to put it mildly. Then there's their only surviving child, Edsel. Even the name tells you something. Ford named his son after a friend, but it's an odd name, and later it would become the name of one of the company's most notorious failures. But for now, he's just a boy growing up in the shadow of a titan. Think about what it means to grow up with Henry Ford as your father in this house. You're surrounded by symbols of success: the great house, the river, the gardens, the guests, the limousines in the driveway. But you're also surrounded by your father's rules, his skepticism of high society, his preachy morality, his suspicion of softness. Edsel was different from Henry. He loved design, art, elegance. He was drawn to the aesthetic side of automobiles, not just the mechanical side. He saw that the world was changing. People didn't just want cheap, black, identical cars forever. They wanted style, color, comfort, beauty. He was right about that. But in this house, being right didn't always protect you. Because Henry didn't just run the company, he dominated it. He humiliated executives. He fired people on a whim. He called his son weak, or implied it often enough. He undercut Edsel's authority in front of others. Imagine being the president of a giant company, and your father still storms into meetings and reverses your decisions in front of everyone. Now, picture Edsel sitting in one of the quieter rooms of Fair Lane late at night, maybe a small sitting room with a fireplace, a few comfortable chairs, and a lamp that throws a warm pool of light. On the table beside him might be sketches, car designs, notes about a new model, maybe some correspondence about union negotiations or factory issues. A drink sits untouched. He hears his father's footsteps in the hall. The conversation could go either way. Henry might talk tenderly about the old days on the farm, or suddenly launch into a tirade about unions, bankers, city people, or some new conspiracy he sees in the newspaper. There's a weight in the room that has nothing to do with the stone walls. This is another kind of darkness in the mansion empire, the way power warps family. For everyone outside, Henry Ford is a hero. For everyone inside these walls, he's a complicated mix of provider, warden, and storm. And then there's the part of Henry Ford the textbooks tend to step around gently, if they mention it at all. His obsession with Jews, his embrace of ugly conspiracies, his willingness to use his wealth and influence to spread them. Imagine, once again, that same study at Fair Lane. On the desk are proofs of articles from his newspaper, because yes, he owned one. The Dearborn Independent. It wasn't just a little local newsletter. Under Ford's ownership, it became a platform for a series of deeply anti-Semitic articles, spreading lies and conspiracy theories about Jewish people controlling the world, banking, the press, everything. Some of this material was based on a forged document called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious piece of propaganda. These articles didn't just stay in Dearborn, they circulated widely. They were compiled into a book. They influenced people far beyond the borders of Michigan. They validated prejudices, fueled hatred, and made toxic ideas feel respectable to some because they carried the informal endorsement of a famous, wildly successful man. Picture Henry at Fair Lane, leafing through those pages, nodding along, thinking he's discovered the truth behind the world's problems. Maybe he walks out into the garden feeling satisfied, not fully grasping that his words might encourage someone across the ocean who has much more violent plans. Now walk back inside. Because while all of this is happening, while Ford is lauded as a genius, while he's spreading harmful ideas, while his factories are grinding workers down and his service department is cracking skulls, his mansions are multiplying. Fair Lane in Dearborn is the heart, but it's not the whole story. There's also the world of Grosse Pointe, Detroit's lakeside enclave of wealth. Think manicured lawns running down to the water, big houses facing the lake like they're watching the horizon. This is old money territory, established families, social clubs, tennis courts, yacht clubs. Edsel and his wife Eleanor build their own home there, known today as the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House. Compared to Fair Lane, it feels different, lighter in some ways. Edsel's taste leans more to European elegance, art, subtle detail. This house is filled with paintings, sculptures, carefully chosen furniture. The gardens are designed to frame views of the lake, to invite lingering walks. It's part of Henry Ford's mansion empire because the money is his, the family is his, but its spirit is more Edsel's. You can almost feel the tension between the world Edsel wanted and the world his father built. Imagine walking into one of the rooms in that house, a long gallery with paintings on the walls, light coming in from the waterside. You see modern art, maybe some pieces that push boundaries for that time. These are the kinds of things Henry might dismiss as weird, useless, decadent. To Edsel, they're windows into other ways of seeing. Now imagine Edsel and Eleanor hosting guests here. Artists, designers, people from New York, Europe, people who think about cars not just as machines, but as moving sculptures. They drink, they talk, they listen to music, they look at the lake shimmering outside. And in the back of Edsel's mind, always, is his father. In Fair Lane, on the river, sitting in that dark wood study, scowling at union headlines or world affairs, muttering about strange art while the Dearborn Independent continues its toxic work. 2 houses, same family, same money, different souls. If you zoom out, you can see the mansion empire not just as a set of buildings, but as a sort of map of Ford's contradictions. Fair Lane, the self-sufficient fortress near the factories, radiating control. The Ford house in Grosse Pointe, radiating culture and aspiration. Winter homes in warmer places where the family could escape the Michigan cold. Hotel suites in New York or Europe where Ford sometimes stayed but never fully felt at home. Everywhere he went, he needed a space that protected him from the world he'd helped create. The world of soot and noise and class conflict and speeding cars and changing morals. He wanted the future to move on his terms. And when it didn't, he reacted with fear and anger. Let's go back to that fear for a moment, because it echoes in some of the darkest episodes linked to his name. Take labor unrest. The River Rouge plant, that sprawling complex of steel and glass and smoke near Dearborn, was ground zero for some of the fiercest battles between workers and management in the 1930s. Unions were gaining strength across the country. The Great Depression had hit. People were desperate, angry, fed up with being treated like replaceable parts. Ford, who had once been seen as enlightened for his wages, became one of the most stubborn, harsh opponents of unions. You may have heard of incidents like the Ford Hunger March or the Battle of the Overpass, where Ford's men attacked Union organizers at the Rouge plant. Think about how those scenes look. Crowds, signs, confrontation, fists, guns, men in suits or overcoats ordering workers to be driven back, sometimes literally beaten down. Now contrast that with the silence of Fair Lane's gardens on those same afternoons. On a day when tear gas drifts over the Rouge, the river at Fair Lane still flows softly past the lawn. Birds still land on the branches of 100-year-old trees. Inside the house, a clock ticks gently in the hallway. A maid adjusts flowers in a vase. Someone sets out tea in a sitting room. If you had wandered into that house at that moment, you might not know anything was wrong. That's one of the eeriest things about these mansions. They preserve a kind of tranquility that, when you know the full story, doesn't feel tranquil at all. It feels like someone pressed mute on the rest of the world. There's another layer too: secrecy. We like to think of big historic houses as open books. Standing here decades later, we see the furniture, the photographs, the clothes in a closet, and we think we know these people. But what you're seeing is the curated version, the museum version, the cleaned-up story that's been told so many times it stops feeling real. But in their day, these mansions were very private. You didn't just stroll up to Fair Lane and knock. Access was controlled. Staff were loyal or replaced. Conversations in certain rooms never left those rooms. Imagine the things that were said late at night between Henry Ford and Harry Bennett in one of the smaller, more secure spaces of the mansion. Maybe a den with the curtains drawn. Maybe a little room near the back where you could talk without being overheard. Keep them in line. We can't give in. They're all communists. Make an example of someone. We don't have transcripts of those chats, but we can see their results. And once you know who these men were, it's not hard to imagine the tone. The mansion doesn't just shield the inhabitants from the outside, it shields the outside from the full truth of what happens within. And if we're talking about secrets, we have to talk about how all of this weighed on Edsel. Because it did. It showed up in his health. By all accounts, Edsel was under intense stress for years, pressured from above by his father, pressured from below by the needs of a changing market and workforce, pulled between the desire to modernize and the iron grip of an older man stuck in older ways. You can picture him at the Grosse Pointe house, looking out at the calm lake, feeling anything but calm. Maybe he spends weekends there trying to recover from grueling weeks at the company. He's got the trappings of an champion privilege, but inside, he's carrying something like a chronic wound. Eventually, that wound becomes physical. Edsel's health declines. He develops serious illness. There are hospital visits, consultations, worry. Now, picture that Grosse Pointe bedroom near the water. Quiet, airy, with sunlight pushing softly through curtains. Family members speak in hushed tones in the hall. Doctors come and go. Henry visits, but the relationship is complicated, heavy with years of unspoken words and harsh moments. Eventually, Edsel dies in 1943 at just 49. The moment lands with a thud in all of Henry Ford's houses. At Fair Lane, the news settles over the rooms like dust that never quite lifts. In the Grosse Pointe house, the grief is sharper, more personal. Eleanor is left a widow. The children are left without a father. The art, the carefully chosen furniture, the views of the lake, they all become part of a story with a missing central figure. For Henry, it's a blow he helped shape without ever intending to. His control, his constant undermining, his refusal to hand over real authority added weight to a man who was already carrying too much. He didn't kill his son, but the environment he created didn't exactly nurture long life. This is another dark truth hidden in the mansion empire. Wealth can insulate you from many dangers, but not from the ones you build inside your own walls. As Henry ages, his grip on reality and on his company grows shakier. He becomes more erratic. His worldview doesn't evolve much. The world is turning modern around him, faster cars, new styles, changing culture. But Fair Lane is like a bubble, preserving an earlier version of his ideals. He walks those halls as an old man now. The carpets he chose decades earlier cushion his steps. Portraits on the walls show younger versions of himself, family, friends. Some of those faces are gone now. The house remembers them even if he tries not to. There's something almost tragic about imagining Henry Ford in those final years, moving from room to room in that big stone house, knowing on some level that the world outside isn't really his anymore. He built the system that made the modern world, but he can't control what that world does with his creation. People modify his cars, race them, paint them bright colors, use them to move to new places, to live new lives he doesn't approve of. He wanted cars to stabilize society, to root people in good, simple lives. In reality, they helped create suburbs, youth culture, road trips, new ways of escaping old towns and old rules. Imagine him sitting by a window at Fair Lane, looking at the river, thinking about those unintended consequences. Does he ever regret anything? Does he ever think about the workers injured on his assembly lines, the union men beaten by his thugs, the people harmed by his newspaper's hate? We don't really know. The house isn't talking, but as you walk through the place now, you can feel the unanswered questions. Fast forward. Henry Ford dies in 1947. The question then becomes, what happens to a mansion empire when its builder is gone? Usually, one of two things happens to a great house after its era ends. It either stays in the family, gradually fading, becoming shabbier, rooms closed off, parts of it unused, or it's turned into a symbol, a museum, a monument. Fair Lane eventually becomes tied to education. The land around it becomes part of a university campus. The house itself becomes an historic site. Visitors can tour it, see Henry's bedroom, walk the halls. Imagine life there. The Grosse Pointe House, Edsel and Eleanor's place, also becomes a historic estate open to the public. On the surface, that looks like a good thing. These places are preserved. They're not bulldozed to make way for condos. The architecture survives. The gardens are maintained. School kids can walk through and, in theory, touch history. But think about how that history is told. A tour guide points out the beautiful carved wood, the imported marble, the clever old appliances. They talk about the architect, the landscaping, the parties held here. They talk about Clara's role, Eleanor's tastes, the famous guests who walk these corridors. They mention, of course, that Henry Ford built a huge auto empire. They might talk about the assembly line, the $5 day. They might even nod to controversies, like his anti-Semitism or labor disputes. But those parts are often smoothed over, wrapped in safe phrasing, quickly moved past. Because there's something uncomfortable about saying to a group of tourists standing in a sunlit hallway, "By the way, the man who lived here published hateful lies about Jewish people and paid men to beat up his workers." We like our historic houses to come with just enough tragedy to feel human, but not so much ugliness that we have to question everything else. So the darkness that once seeped out from these walls gets cleaned up, painted over, turned into a footnote. Yet it's still there if you know where to look. Stand in Henry's bedroom and remember that he sometimes had bodyguards close by, especially when tensions were high. This is supposed to be the most private, vulnerable space of any person, the place you sleep. But when you rule through fear, you rarely sleep entirely peacefully. Walk through the halls and picture staff whispering about strikes, about newspaper articles, about who was in the study last night and what that might mean for everyone's future. Look at the grand staircase and imagine executives climbing it with their caps in their hands, nervous, hoping they're not about to be fired in a single sentence or asked to carry out orders they'll regret. Stand on the terrace and look toward the river. Imagine the glow of the Rouge plant in the distance, the faint rumble of industry carrying on the wind. The mansion and the factory are connected. One feeds off the other. One bathes in soft lamplight while the other burns through men's bodies. When you put all of this together, a different picture of Henry Ford's mansion empire emerges. It stops being just big fancy houses built by a rich guy and starts looking like a physical manifestation of his contradictions. A man who preached simplicity but lived in grandeur. A man who claimed to lift up workers while spying on them and crushing their unions. A man who revered common sense but fell for elaborate conspiracies. A man who wanted control so badly he drove away the one person who might have carried his company forward with more grace, his own son. And a man whose houses, after his death, became quiet shrines to a story we're still not entirely honest about. So what do we do with all this? If you visit these estates today, you might be struck first by their beauty, the craftsmanship, the way the light falls across old stone, the sense of stepping into another time. That's normal. That's part of why we're drawn to places like this. But maybe, as you stand in those rooms, or even just look at photos of them, you let one extra thought in. Maybe you picture the unseen lives that paid for every carved banister and imported tile, the workers breathing metal dust, the wives worried about company investigators snooping around, the union men gathering in secret, the families reading hateful words in a newspaper with Henry Ford's imprint. You start to see the mansion not just as a rich man's home, but as the top layer of a pyramid built on the backs of thousands of people. And if you do that, something interesting happens. The house doesn't become less beautiful, but the beauty becomes complicated. It stops being purely aspirational and starts being instructive. Because in a way, the story of Henry Ford's mansion empire is a warning. It's a warning about what happens when enormous wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of one man whose values go largely unchallenged behind closed doors. It's a warning about the stories we tell about great men and how much they leave out. It's a warning about how easy it is for success to be used as a shield against accountability. Standing in those rooms, you can feel how seductive that shield must have been. How tempting it would be to stay inside, to believe your own press, to see critics as enemies, to think your instincts are always right because, well, look around. You built all this, didn't you? But the world always knocks eventually. For Henry Ford, it knocked in the form of unions that wouldn't go away, of public backlash against his newspaper's hate, of a son lost too soon, of a reputation that would never again be as spotless as the early hero worship suggested. For us, the knock comes in a quieter way. It comes when we look at these preserved mansions not as fairy tale castles, but as human houses. Places where a flawed man lived out both brilliance and cruelty. Places where the ghosts aren't transparent figures in old clothes, but unresolved questions about justice, responsibility, and memory. If you were to stand today in the middle of Fair Lane's Great Hall late in the afternoon, when the light slants in sideways and the house feels suspended between day and night, you might hear nothing but the faint hum of an air system and the distant sound of students or visitors outside. But if you listen with the story in mind, you can almost hear more. The echo of bootsteps of detectives climbing the stairs to a meeting, the low murmur of an argument behind a yet closed door, the scratch of a pen signing off on a policy that will ripple outward into workers' lives, the soft crackle of pages turning as Henry reads yet another article confirming his worst suspicions about the world, the muffled sob of a family member behind a bedroom door after bad news. This mansion is not just architecture, it's an archive of human choices. The same is true of the Ford house by the lake, with its galleries and gardens. It contains different echoes, laughter from parties, conversations about art and design, parental tenderness, the quiet grief of a widow, the confusion of children trying to understand why their father isn't coming home. Taken together, Henry Ford's mansion empire is a story about how success is never simple, how every empire, no matter how clean its public image, has corridors it doesn't want you to walk down. But we've walked down them anyway, at least in our minds. We've gone from the river's edge to the study desk, from the workers' rented houses to the marble foyers, from the factory gates to the bedroom where a tired old man listens to the house creak and wonders what will be remembered. Maybe that's the final layer of darkness here, the selective memory. We're very good as societies at polishing the stories of our industrial heroes, turning them into statues and headlines and inspirational quotes. We're less good at sitting with the parts that hurt, the parts that complicate the comfort. Yet, oddly enough, those are the parts that make the story worth telling all the way to the end. Because once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. And that changes how you look at everything. From the car in your driveway to the mansion in the glossy brochure to the way we talk about success. So the next time you see an image of a grand estate with sweeping lawns and elegant windows, maybe you'll pause for half a second and ask yourself, what had to happen for this place to exist? Whose hands made the bricks, the beams, the fortune? What choices were made in these quiet rooms that the world outside had to live with? And whose story hasn't been told yet? In the case of Henry Ford's mansions, we know some of those answers now. We know enough to say this: behind the pleasant tour scripts and the picturesque gardens, behind the myth of the kindly carmaker who just wanted to help the common man, there is a darker, heavier tale. A tale of control disguised as care, of prejudice dressed up as truth, of violence outsourced to rough men in suits while the boss sat in lamplight, far from the factory floor. It doesn't erase the innovations. It doesn't erase the ways the automobile opened new possibilities for millions of people. Both things can be true. He can be a mechanical genius and a moral cautionary tale at the same time. That's adulthood, really, holding both truths without flinching. And maybe that's why, for a lot of people in that 30 to 60 age range, This kind of story hits differently. You've seen enough of life to know heroes aren't pure, villains aren't always obvious, and success usually leaves some kind of shadow. Henry Ford's mansion empire is that shadow-made stone. If you ever walk those halls in person, you might run your hand along the smooth wood of a banister, feel the cool solidity of the carved newel post, look up the staircase and imagine a stern figure in a suit on the landing. You might step into the study and picture papers on the desk, a half-finished letter, a cup of coffee gone cold. And you might think quietly, this is where a lot of the 20th century went right, and this is where some of it went very, very wrong. The river still moves by outside, indifferent. The mansions still stand. And their dark story, once you hear it, lingers long after you've stepped back out into the light.